Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. Looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 394. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about beaches, one really big statue, and favelas as we go to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. No news for today, but I did want to encourage you that if you are hearing this before November 15th of 2013, you can vote for the Amateur Traveler every day if you want to in the Podcast Awards, podcastawards.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Kay from thekdays.com, who's come to talk to us about Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Kay, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris.
Now, you are not originally from Rio, but you are living there now.
Yes, I am currently a university student and also a travel writer. And when I came upon the opportunity to live here in Rio de Janeiro for a semester, I jumped on it. And so now I'm living here, and I will be staying here until January of 2014.
Excellent. Now, the first thing I have to ask is, I think when we say Rio, a lot of us get one of two visual images in our minds, well, maybe one of a couple. One is Carnival, and one is Ibiza. Is Rio what you expected it would be?
In many ways, yes, and in many ways, no. Rio is often seen as a very tropical, paradise kind of city, naturally beautiful, but also crazy and hectic like the average city. And when I came here, I was awestruck about how beautiful the towering rocks are, the white sand beaches, the people. But like any other city, it is a city where people live and they work, and there's lots of traffic, lots of movement. And so in many respects, I think people forget about the average life of somebody who lives in a city, as grandiose as Rio may seem on television.
Excellent. Well, why should someone come to Rio?
Rio, in my opinion, of all of the cities that I visited, definitely has a culture and an aura that is completely different than anywhere that I've ever seen before. There are a lot of events that occur here, like the Pope just came last July, and they have big music festivals here. And then, of course, the World Cup and the Olympics will also be held here within the next couple of years. So there's definitely a lot of development and a lot of movement around the city. But Rio as a city itself is very charming and has a great sense of community. Brazilians are all very nice, and especially to tourists who they can speak with and interact with. But I think one of the best reasons that someone should come to Rio is that when you walk around and you're going to attractions like the Christ the Redeemer statue or going to go shopping in one of the markets, there's a lot more to see by just walking around the city, getting to your destination. So it really does emulate the idea that it's not just about the destination, but it's also about the journey. When you're walking around the street, you can see live musicians, samba bands playing in the street, free to listen to, people dancing, people headed to the beach, and also just an energy here that's very, very different than a lot of other cities that I've visited.
Excellent. What kind of itinerary would you recommend for somebody who's coming to Rio for, say, a week or two rather than the 6 months that you're going to be there?
I think that some of the most important things to see in Rio are very people centric. Of course, seeing the Christ the Redeemer statue is an
Mhm.
absolute must. Not only is the statue amazing, but the view from the mountain on which it stands is striking. It's breathtaking. The city is obviously naturally beautiful, but seeing it from such a high altitude is absolutely amazing.
When I started to say earlier that two pictures came to mind and I changed to three, that was the third picture that came to mind. So,
Yes, and it is really worth the effort to make it up to that statue because there's a lot to see from the bird's eye view of the city rather than being among the people. But there are also a lot of nature hikes. There's the Pão de Açúcar, which is a big rock here in the city that you can take a cable car up to the top. You can also see a different view of the city than from the Redeemer statue, and you can see the statue towering over the city, which is makes for beautiful photos and also just for a beautiful afternoon.
now, is that the same one that hang gliders often jump off of, too?
There are a few of those, but I believe that's one of them.
Okay.
Another thing that's very, very prominent here in the city is street markets, open air markets. They're all very, very interesting to walk around because a lot of them have crafts, artisans, fresh foods, local foods, live music. There's one in particular that I love to frequent called the Hippie Fair. It's located in Ipanema in General Osorio Park. And every Sunday they have a bunch of artisans that go there and sell their paintings, their artworks, their crafts. And it's really nice to just walk around and see kind of the art of the city on a local perspective rather than in a museum.
You mentioned crafts and local foods. What kind of crafts would we find and what kind of foods are local in these kind of markets?
So the crafts, for example, they have a lot of tribal instruments from the Amazon region. They have paintings, they have small sculptures, bags, clothes, lots of just handcrafts, things that artisans make. And as for the food, there's a lot of it's really hard to explain the food in Brazil and in Rio especially because of course Brazil is famous for its meats, its steaks. Churrasco is very very famous here, and you can get it anywhere from the street food level, which you can usually find in the markets, all the way up to the churrascaria, which could easily be 100 to 120 reais or even dollars per person for a night at that restaurant. But churrasco is very prominent here. And my personal favorite food is called frango a passarinho. It's fried chicken, but it's a very stylistically different. It's not breaded, it's just fried, it's very fresh, and it's amazing. And lastly, there's the famous caipirinha, which is often sold at the beach and in the markets. The caipirinha is a mixture of Brazilian hard liquor called cachaça and lime juice and sugar. It's basically just those three ingredients mixed together and served. When you're walking around the markets, you can just go to any of the stands and pick up any of these Brazilian foods or others.
Excellent. And sorry, I interrupted you while you were taking us around. Where do we go after the market?
After the market, the beach is about 1 block away. And if you're going to come to Rio and do just one thing, I would say the beach is definitely something that you should do. The beaches here are very famous for tourists and for locals alike. On the weekends, it's funny because you can walk by the beach and see so many umbrellas that you can't even see the sand. It gets very crowded, but it's a great way to immerse yourself on a local level because locals as well as tourists hang out on the beach. They're beautiful. The water is very clean. The sand is beautifully white, and there you can see all of the rock formations and the city from the beaches. There are also lots of beach vendors that sell the foods that I spoke of earlier, and it's a great place to sit and listen to the sounds of the city.
And you say the beaches. Do you have a favorite or two?
I have 2 favorite beaches, I would say. My personal favorites are Ipanema Beach because I'd say it's more heavily frequented by locals than Copacabana. And also a small beach in Zona Sul, the south zone of the city, called Praia Vermelha, the Red Beach. It's very, very tiny, secluded in between two large rock formations, one of which is the Pão de Açúcar. And it's just a beautiful place that not that many people go to.
Excellent. Where to next?
Another place that's kind of up and coming for tourists are the favelas of the city. I've gotten to know the favelas pretty well because I actually volunteer here a couple of times a week. And before, there have been many films, documentaries made about how dangerous the favelas are. But since pacification a few years ago, they've become a lot safer and have piqued the interest of a lot of tourists because they want to know what the realities are versus the films. There are a lot of local companies that are based in the favelas that are run by people who were born and raised there. And these tour operators will give tourists an insider's glimpse of the favela, what it looks like, what it's like to live there, what kind of activities they have there. I think that favelas are important to explore because they are the birthplace of a lot of the things in Brazil that are important to Brazilian culture, like samba, like soccer, baile funky music, and of course the famous Carnival was born in some of Rio's favelas.
And when we say the favelas, I just want to make sure that everybody has the same mental picture, although many people have probably watched the same films that I have. So we're talking about the traditionally poor neighborhoods that tend to snake up into the hillsides around the city.
Yes. The areas of poverty, or in the past areas of poverty, that are located on the hills and typically are very multicolored in terms of the houses that you see.
And you say you're volunteering there, so you're not just doing the quick in and out tourism favela tour, which I know there's been controversy about too. Is that something that is exploiting the poverty, or is that something that is supporting the local economy? First of all, for a favela tour, do you have one that you recommend?
Yes, actually. The biggest favela here in the city is called Rocinha, and it's located in between Salconhado Beach and the south zone of the city, so Leblon, Ipanema. And this is the biggest favela, the biggest impoverished area or slum in Latin America. And so it's very famous. They have a tour company there called Favela Adventure. It's run by a man called Zezinho, and he was born in Rocinha and has local friends who will give tours of the favela to any tourist. He speaks fluent English, is very, very nice with tourists. And I think that if a tourist does want to see the favela, it's a good thing and it can be a very rewarding experience, but it's important to pay particular attention to who operates the tour,
right? The
tours that you're looking into. And I always say to go with the people who live in the favelas, because not only is it better for the economy of the favela and for the image of the favela, it's also better for the tourists because they get a sincere, a genuine look at what it's like to live there and what some of the best areas of the favela are.
And then for somebody who's staying longer, you found a volunteer opportunity. How did you find that, and what did you end up doing?
I actually found this volunteer opportunity through that same website, Favela Adventure. They have pages for if you want to stay in the favela, if you want to volunteer there, if you want to go to an event there. They have all sorts of resources for that. So I found the organization I work with, which is an Italian NGO called, I'm going to butcher this name, but Il Sorriso dei miei bimbi. And I really liked it because it's about social education, not only educating students about math or how to write, but educating students on what's going on in the economy, what's going on with the government, and kind of bringing students, adolescents, ages 13 to 18, to make wiser choices than to get into the drug trade or get into trouble at a very young age, get into crime, which has always been a terrible issue within the favelas, the cycle of poverty that is fueled by the drug trade. And so the students go there every day of the week, Monday through Friday, and they learn about social issues, environmental issues, and things that they can use to improve their lives and hopefully improve the lives of the people that they come in contact with within the favela.
Excellent. Where to next?
One place that I visited very recently that I absolutely love is the Feira do São Cristóvão. It's in the North Zone, which isn't as much frequented by tourists, but it's a huge stadium that they renovated and turned into an open-air market. But the special thing about this particular open air market is that it has influences from the northeast region of Brazil, which is a completely different region. And so a lot of visitors to Rio won't have the opportunity to go visit the northeast areas and can find the food, can find the music, the shows, and the kind of culture of the northeast region in this fair. It's pretty easy to get to by metro, and after the metro, taking a bus. And it only costs 3 reais to get in, which is the equivalent of about $1.50 US dollars. And it's absolutely amazing. You can spend the entire day there listening to live music, dancing, learning how to dance, eating food typical of the Northeast, and things like that.
Excellent. And you mentioned buses and the metro. You may have answered my next question, which was best way to get around.
Yes. So if you're planning on primarily staying in the South Zone, walking is pretty sufficient, especially just going to the beach or going to a restaurant, going to a street market. However, if you do want to visit other places like the North Zone or the West Zone, then taking a bus, I would say, is the best way to do that. It's a little bit tricky because many of the motoristas, the bus drivers, don't speak English. And so navigating around the city can be a little bit difficult. But if you know where you're going, you can find any bus that says that final destination, and you can hop on it and you'll get there. Another very good resource for getting around the city is a website called Vá de Ônibus.
Oh, go by bus.
Yes, go by bus in Portuguese. And you can put the name of your street and the name of the street that you need to get to, and it will give you a list of all of the buses that you can take to get to your destination.
Excellent. And you mentioned Portuguese, and that is, of course, one thing that's odd about Brazil because of an ancient agreement between the Portuguese and the Spain as they divided up the world with the Pope's approval. They ended up with Portuguese in Brazil, and only in Brazil and all of South America. Did you know Portuguese going down?
I did not. I knew very minimal Portuguese, basically just how to say hello and thank you.
Okay. Which is where many of us would be if we came there. We know Spanish potentially, but very few people, I think, in North America know Portuguese. So how easy was it to get around until you learned some Portuguese? And what was the best way to learn Portuguese that you found?
For me, it was relatively difficult, I would say, arriving there and not knowing Portuguese. But getting around got easier after a few days because once you start to recognize the layout of the city, and especially the area that you're in, you can find a bus or you can find a metro line or even just ask somebody. And people are usually very accommodating because, as the stereotype goes, Brazilians are very, very friendly, extremely friendly. If you ask a person for directions, many times they'll not only explain to you how to get there, but also will either walk you to the nearest road to put you on it or walk you all the way to the destination themselves. And that was very helpful in the beginning when I wasn't speaking a lot of Portuguese because when they explained something to me and I didn't understand and I gave them a blank gaze, they would just immediately think to walk me to where I needed to go or put me on the bus to where I needed to go. And that was extremely helpful. So I would say if somebody comes to Rio with very little Portuguese, learning enough to where they can ask for directions or just say, I'm lost, is definitely enough to get around because people are always willing to help. In terms of learning Portuguese, I actually took a class. So with my program in study abroad, I took a class once I got here, intensive Portuguese, which was about 6 hours a day.
Oh, wow.
For 3 weeks straight. So that's a little bit extreme. But I would say that, in all honesty, I learned more from really talking to people, talking to the person sitting next to me on the bus, talking to my host family, talking to people in the restaurant, trying to order food and drinks in Portuguese, and just using it as many times as I can. Even with other friends who spoke English, the more we practiced our Portuguese, the easier it was to communicate with just about everyone. So I would say for somebody looking to learn a little bit of Portuguese, really going out of your way to talk with people and to practice it and to listen to when other people are talking is extremely helpful.
Excellent. Are there places that you would go that would be a particularly good place to go if you wanted to meet some of the locals, if you wanted to do more interacting?
Yes. And this kind of brings me back to the food question, but there are local restaurants all over the place in every neighborhood and on every street, basically, called lanchonetes. And they're basically locally owned small restaurants where you can get either a snack or a drink or a small plate of food. They're usually very cheap, and these are the places that most of the locals go to eat because the restaurants here can be extremely expensive. And so, one way really to interact with locals is to go to these lanchonetes for food. And not only will you save some money, but you'll get to interact with locals and see when they go out how they order and what they order. So it's a very good way to meet people. I've met a lot of people just sitting in the lanchonette and striking up a conversation with the person sitting next to me. It's very locally infused and a good way to get a grasp of that culture.
Excellent. And any particular local who stands out is having made the biggest impact on you?
There are two answers I have to this question. The first is the one local that has really made an impact on me has been my host mother. She has been extremely gracious to me, and even though she speaks pretty much no English, she's always been there to help me, to offer to take me to one of her tango classes or out to eat or to hang out with her family. And she always makes the best coffee in the morning, and she's really become a host mother to me, not just somebody who I rent a room from, not just somebody who I see and in a passive way, but she's really been a big help and a big influence on my time here in Brazil. The other group, I should say, of people that have influenced me greatly are my students that I work with in my NGO. They're ages 13 to 18, very lively, super intelligent, and they're just so much fun. I volunteer on days when I have a 7 a.m. class, which means I need to leave my house at 6 o'clock in the morning. So usually I'm pretty tired once I get to them, but they always brighten my day and always help me learn the slang, the gíria as they call it. They always put a smile on my face because they're so lively and they always want to know more about how to speak Spanish or what it's like in the United States, or if they're listening to some music from the US, they'll ask me to translate the lyrics for them so that they can understand what the person is saying. And it's just so much fun, and it's a great way to practice my Portuguese, but to also teach them a little bit about where I'm from.
Excellent. Are there other places we should talk about in terms of places to go and see in the city?
Yes, one more. One of the main areas for tourists to visit, and one that I think is well worth the trek, is the centro of the city, the center. Mm-hmm. It's where a lot of the history of the city has occurred, and it's very full of museums, very full of historic restaurants, old buildings. There's an area very close to Centro, which is called Lapa, and that's where a big chunk of the bars of the city are located, as well as the nightclubs. So for anyone looking to experience the nightlife, Lapa is definitely the place where everyone goes, locals and tourists alike. But Centro is interesting because it's full of more historical, artistic elements of the city that aren't as prevalent here in Zona Sul with the beaches and the street markets. If a tourist or somebody visiting did want to learn more about the history of Brazil and the history and the art and the cultural influences of Rio de Janeiro, then Centro is an amazing place to go to learn about that.
Excellent. Now, are there particular places you would go, museums or theaters or whatever, to get in touch with the culture of Brazil that you mentioned in Centro?
Yes, so there's one museum that I really like because I love art. It's the Museu das Belas Artes. It basically is the art museum of the city. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure about this, but I believe that every Tuesday, people of student age can get in for free. I haven't gone on a Tuesday yet, but I've heard this from many people. And they just have a big collection of Brazilian artwork as well as artwork that they call foreign national artwork. And it's a great place to go to get a feel for not only the art of Brazil, but also the politics and kind of the historical eras of Brazil that influence the artwork.
Excellent. What surprised you about Rio?
When I first arrived, I kind of had a big culture shock moment because having lived in the United States all my life and having explored Europe and some places in Central America, coming to Rio and coming to Brazil was a big shock for me. First of all, when I went to the beach for the first time, I was wearing my American swimsuit, not really expecting too much, and you realize
Two
that...
or three times more fabric than anybody else was wearing?
Exactly. The swimsuits there, men's and women's, are much smaller than in the United States. So that was a big culture shock for me. I ended up buying one, but one of the more modest kind. And it's funny because now my friends and I can sit on the beach and tell who the tourists are versus the locals. Also, another thing that really surprised me about Rio is how much you can see just walking, just taking a walk in the city.
Uh-huh.
If you get on your feet and go for a walk in the morning, especially on Sunday mornings, you'll see a lot of things that you would miss if you were in a cab or on a bus, like samba musicians on the beach just playing for people for tips, or violinists that are on the street playing music, both of the classical genre and also covers of Brazilian pop songs. It's very easy to run into street markets that I'd never seen before or even heard of. But walking the city really gives you kind of a feel for what it's like to live there, I think, more so than anything else. And I think that I've learned the most about my time here from the very first day I arrived, just from walking around and from taking days to just take in the sights and the sounds and the smells of the city.
And when did you arrive?
I arrived here on July 8th of this year.
Okay, and we're talking in mid-October. Best time of the year in your experience to go to Brazil?
Depends on what you are looking for.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking for the time that's full of energy and tourists and extremely hot outside, everyone's on the beach, then I would say definitely November to December. If you are looking for a time that's a little bit less hot and a little bit less full of tourists, then when I arrived in July, August, even September is also a great time because it never gets cold here. So the weather is milder. It's not as hot. There are fewer tourists, and you can get a more local feel for what things are like here versus when the influx of tourists arrive in November.
Excellent. What did your guidebooks recommend you to do that you would recommend people not waste their time on?
I think that one thing that I definitely wouldn't recommend, as I said earlier, are any favela tours that are commercialized outside of the favela. So a tour company that does tours of all of Brazil, that does a tour to a favela, typically will have just a regular tour guide lead there. I definitely would not recommend that.
Okay.
There are a lot of churrascarias here in the city, big fancy restaurants that serve the traditional meat, churrasco, that are extremely expensive but also extremely overridden with tourists. And it's gotten to the point where there are miles fewer locals at these places than tourists. And I would say if you do want to try the local food, maybe not going to one of the restaurants recommended by the guidebooks, but more searching for it in a lanchonete or on the street food.
Now, say you did want that traditional meal, but you wanted it at a restaurant that was not quite as crazy expensive. Do you have any of the ones that you would recommend personally?
There's one in the Bairro, the neighborhood, called Botafogo, and the restaurant is called Águia dos Andes, the Eagle of the Andes.
Oh, okay.
It's a small restaurant. It's also a bar, and usually my friends and I will go there. And most of the meals you can split. You can get them for about 24 to 30 reais. So split between two people is very reasonable. And the food is great.
It's about 3 to 1 reais to a dollar from what you said previously?
It fluctuates, but it's about 2 to 1.
2 to 1, okay.
Reais to dollars. This restaurant is very reasonable. The atmosphere is great. And it's actually very local. Not many tourists know about it. I think because I've started to bring more and more of my friends to this restaurant since I arrived, they actually just renovated the menu and put a few of the menu items in English. And so I think that it's a great place to go to, especially on nights when there's a football match, a soccer game, because there's so many people there and there's such good energy, and you can order food, order a beer, order a caipirinha, and just hang out with locals and tourists alike.
Excellent. What's the best day you've had in Rio? Single best day you've had?
There was a day that really nothing extremely special happened, but it was very fun for a lot of reasons. I spent the whole day at the beach, talked to a lot of Brazilians with my newly learned Portuguese, met up with some friends from the exchange program that I'm in. We went to an Arab food restaurant actually that night and got some Arab food. And then we took a blanket and we went to the lake, the Lagoa, that's located in a little bit inland from the beach in Zona Sul. And we put out a blanket and we talked all night, sipping on some beers and just hanging out as friends. We spoke in Portuguese and in English, and the night was beautiful. You could see all the buildings lit up in Rio. You could even see a couple of stars, which is extremely impressive given the amount of light pollution in the city. And they built a bonfire right by the lake, so it was just the perfect night to relax, take in the city, and be with good friends.
On the flip side, one warning you would give to people before they go to Rio?
One warning that I would give to anybody in Rio is to be very careful with electronics on the street. Rio is very well guarded. There are police everywhere, but there's still a lot of crime, especially against tourists. And electronics generally cost a lot more here because of import taxes and things like that. So while maybe you paid about $200 for your iPhone back at the States, here it will cost the equivalent of almost $800. So taking photos with your iPhone out on the street, walking around with it out, or using it to call someone is generally looked down upon and not very safe, because if somebody sees you with it, they could easily think to just snatch it from you. It's happened to a lot of my friends on the streets of Rio and at the beach, and that's definitely something that I would advise against, is having your electronics just out while you're walking down the street or when you're not really using them.
Before we wrap this up with the last few questions, anything else that you think that people should know before they go to Rio?
One thing that's really important to know is that there really isn't a huge population of people here that speak English. It's very important to learn at least a couple of phrases, the basics. I'm lost, thank you, hello, goodbye, in Portuguese, because not only does that help you get around the city, but it also gives off a good impression to the locals that you may be asking for help, that you may be interacting with. Definitely learning a few phrases in Portuguese is helpful.
Excellent. Can you tell us those phrases in Portuguese?
Yes, of course. Hello, you can say oi, or if it's the morning, you can say bom dia. Thank you is, if you're a girl, thank you is obrigada. And for men, it's obrigado. Goodbye, you say ciao, just like Italy, I suppose. And I'm lost. Eu estou perdido, or perdida. Perdida for girls, perdido for boys.
Excellent. Couple final questions. You're standing in the prettiest spot in Rio. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
I'm standing at the top of Rocinha, the favela I mentioned earlier, and looking down at the view of the city. I think that Rocinha boasts the best views of the city.
Excellent. It's interesting because I know people have said that with Rio, it's kind of odd that the rich people live in the flatlands and the poor people live in the best views.
Yeah, it's very true, though.
One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Rio.
People are always kissing each other. Always kissing each other here. When you meet somebody for the first time, you kiss them once on one cheek and then once on the other cheek. They call it dois beijos, 2 kisses. On the street, public displays of affection. On the beach, public displays of affection. And when you meet up with your friends, you also do the dois beijos. So people are just always kissing each other here.
Excellent. Finish this sentence. You really know you're in Rio when what?
When you're sitting on the beach and there are 5 vendors approaching you with the exact same product.
And what's the product, probably?
Mache Leon, a type of tea that they have here, similar to iced tea, but with a little bit different flavor.
Okay. And if you had to summarize Rio in just 3 words, what 3 words would you choose?
A cidade maravilhosa, the marvelous city.
Excellent, excellent. And to do it in Portuguese, bonus points for that. Kay, thanks so much for coming on the show and telling us about your newfound love for Rio. Where can people read more about your travels?
People can read more about my travels on thekdays.com. I write every day pretty much there about what I'm doing and what I'm seeing.
Excellent. And your best post on Rio is what?
So when I mentioned that people here are always kissing, I wrote a post about the kissing culture of Brazil and of Rio specifically, and it basically outlines all the different ways that people kiss each other here. So definitely check it out if you want to learn more about that.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for coming on The Amateur Traveler.
Thank you very much for having me. Muito obrigada.
If this show is a little short on the beginning and the end, the community news at this section and the news at the front section, I apologize, but that's because I have to pack tonight for a trip to Belgium tomorrow, and you'll hear more about that later on in episodes of The Amateur Traveler, I am sure, but I'm going there on a press trip. So with that, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, feel free to send them to host@amateurtraveler.com. Leave them on the Facebook community, facebook.com/amateurtraveler, or better yet, leave them as a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening. And don't forget to vote for Amateur Traveler, podcastawards.com.